What if I told you that English in the Philippines was never just about language, but about power and control? It is seen as a mark of intelligence and success. Schools enforce it and workplaces demand it, and many of us were punished for speaking our native languages. But why exactly is English seen as the language that defines someone's success, that measures someone's intelligence, that measures someone's value as a person? Mabuhay, Earn Kapampangan, Luwid kayo, enin bahasasug, salam kasilasa. Recently, a university in the Philippines sparked controversy by requiring that all communications be in English. So today, we're diving deep into the history of English-only policies in the Philippines. So most people think that English became dominant in the Philippines because it helps us compete globally. It helps make Filipinos more educated. But did you know that in the very beginning, this was not about progress. It was about conquest. First things first, long before colonialism, the islands we now call the Philippines were already multilingual. Indigenous languages like Kapampangan, Cebuano, Ilocano, Tagalog, Maranao, Waray-Waray, Aytamagindi, Aytamaganchi, and so many others have coexisted without a single language dominating archipelago. Yet trade, governance, and diplomacy flourished, proving that linguistic diversity was never a barrier to progress. Our ancestors were natural multilinguals, often using their fluency in their mother tongues, other local languages, and foreign languages like Bahasa Melayu and Arabic to communicate across different ethnicities. And this interconnected network allowed them to engage in commerce, politics, and cultural exchange across Asia, from the Arab world all the way to Japan, long before colonialism disrupted and supplanted these ancient systems. But let's go back to the early 1900s. The Philippine-American War was still raging when the United States deployed an army of teachers, known as the Thomasites, to establish an American-style education system in the Philippines. But this was not just about education. It was about reshaping Filipino identity. In fact, schools were designed to produce obedient workers, not critical thinkers. English became the primary medium of instruction, and native languages were discouraged or outright banned. And I remember my lola, who grew up in Pangasinan and Manila before World War II, she would tell me stories of how they were punished physically in school for speaking Pangasinan or even Tagalog. English was the only language allowed, and not just any English, but the polished, pre-war American English of the time. And they were trained to speak in the perfect American school accent, even though English was not their native tongues. And this was true across the country. Students were punished for speaking their native languages. Many faced humiliating consequences, like being forced to stand in the corner of the classroom or repeatedly write lines in English as a warning to others, and even worse, kneeling on mung beans for hours. But this wasn't just about enforcing English. It was about erasing Filipino consciousness. Students were taught that their own cultures, history, and languages were inferior. In fact, school books focused on Western values, painting pre-colonial and early Filipino societies as nothing but primitive and backwards. For example, our pre-colonial ancestors had rich oral traditions, unique writing systems like baybayin and kulitan, and deep ties to our neighboring cultures. But under the American system, Filipino students learned more about George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, more than our own bayanis. They learned more about American literature, more than our own epics like the Ilocano Biyag ni Lamang or the Maranao Darangin. Unknown to many, the curriculum was actually built to create generations of Filipinos who saw themselves as inferior to Americans. Generations of Filipinos who believed that true progress meant abandoning our own identities in favor of English, Western ideals, and allegiance to America. And that is exactly what happened. Even after they left, Filipino teachers who were trained under the American system continued to enforce English as the language of instruction for decades. And jobs in the government, education, and business heavily favored those who are fluent in English. And thus, speaking in English became a marker of intelligence, success, and even social class. But even after independence, English did not just stay. It actually became more dominant. And it wasn't just about policy or practicality. It was all about power and influence. So after World War II, the Filipino elite, many of whom were educated in American schools, kept English as the language of governance and business, and along with a new national language called Filipino, based on Tagalog, both the 1935 and the 1987 constitutions reinforced English as an official language, making sure that it remained dominant. And so fluency in English once again became a status symbol, the marker of intelligence and sophistication. But there was one major attempt to balance the dominance of English, and this was the 1974 by bilingual education policy. So on paper, it seemed promising and simple. English for math and science, while Filipino for social studies and humanities. But in reality, it reinforced the idea that English was the language of technical expertise and development, while Filipino was limited to culture and tradition. It's like saying that English is the key to the future, while Filipino was limited to the past. And instead of creating a true balance, it only strengthened the belief that English meant intelligence, while Filipino was something lesser. And actually, nothing much changed from the time of my lola in the 30s to when I was in elementary school back in the 90s. Students like me, little kids, were punished for every non-English or non-Tagalog word we spoke. And I remember being fined 1 peso for every Kapampangan word I said, even though we were in Angeles, in the heart of Pampanga. But it wasn't just about the fee. It was about enforcing the idea that certain languages did not belong in formal spaces. Now, I don't blame the teachers because this was the policy set by forces much higher and much powerful than them. And for many Filipinos, this belief carried into adulthood, shaping how they approach education, work, and social life. Many Filipinos have been told, "Ang galing mo naman mag-English, parang di ka Pilipino. Wow, you're so great at English that you don't even sound or seem Filipino." Now, while often meant as a compliment, it actually reveals deeply ingrained assumptions about language and intelligence. Now, it's one thing for English to dominate schools and workplaces. But why exactly is English seen as the language that defines someone's success, that measures someone's intelligence, that measures someone's value as a person? The answer to this is not just found in the policies. It is also found in pop culture. It is also shaped by the media. If you watch Filipino entertainment in Filipino show business, English speakers are often portrayed as wealthy, educated, and powerful. Meanwhile, characters who speak Bisaya, Ilocano, or Kapampangan, or other languages other than Tagalog or English, are often reduced to comic relief or lower-class roles. And for decades, this pattern is everywhere. Even advertising reinforces English as a status symbol. Now, over the decades, Taglish has been more common in commercials and TV shows. But luxury brands and corporate ads still use English to signal prestige and credibility. Indeed, the same can be said for politics and current events. For decades, major news networks, newspapers, and government speeches have heavily favored English, excluding millions of Filipinos who are less fluent. In fact, if you look at it, legal documents, court proceedings, and official policies all remain in complex English, and thus creating more barriers to genuine political engagement and economic development. And then there's also Hollywood's global dominance. We cannot deny that the widespread influence of American media further cements the belief that English is the key to success. And if you think about it, the dominance of English in media and pop culture, not just in the Philippines, fuels the idea that it is not just a language, but a measure of intelligence and success. Now, I have nothing against English, but perpetuating such ideas will only keep pushing our local languages further into oblivion. Now I know, some people might say, but Kirby, you're making this entire video in English. And that's true, because the reality is, in a world dominated and shaped by colonialism, English remains the most dominant language, especially on the internet. Like for example, despite the fact that only 18% of the world speaks English, nearly 50% of the world's websites are in English by default. But that is exactly why we need to have these conversations, so that one day, discussing our people's histories, cultures, and future, and everything in between in all our languages is not seen as a weakness or as a limitation, but as a strength. And actually, this is not the first time I've talked about this. Over the years, I've given lectures and even done a speaking tour in both Kapampangan and Tagalog on this very issue. But no matter where I go, one thing is clear. Our people want to uplift our languages. They want to preserve our mother tongues. They just need the space, the support, and the resources to do it. So we are told since the 1900s that English gives us an advantage. But does it always lead to better opportunities? Or can it actually create more barriers? Let's be honest, colonial mentality is deeply embedded in the Philippines. Many Filipinos have internalized the belief that speaking English makes them superior. And let's face it, linguistic discrimination is real. If you speak fluent English, you're seen as smart. And if you struggle with English, people assume that you're less competent, even if you have other valuable skills or immense knowledge. In fact, many Filipinos struggle with advanced subjects in schools because they are taught entirely in English, even though research shows that students learn better, much better, when complex concepts are first introduced in their mother tongues. English-only policies in schools make learning even harder. For many students, especially those from rural areas and marginalized communities, learning learning entirely in English adds an extra barrier. Instead of focusing on the subject, they struggle with the language itself, which sadly affects academic performance and one's confidence. Now, beyond the classroom, the dominance of both English and the national language Filipino, which is based on Manila's Tagalog, has actually led to linguistic and cultural erasure. Across the country, in many rural areas, in many schools outside Metro Manila, native languages are underrepresented or even ignored, isolating indigenous learners and discouraging many from preserving their mother tongues. And over time, some languages have actually become endangered as younger generations are pressured to prioritize English and Tagalog for both social and economic survival. Now consider this. In call centers, workers are trained to neutralize their accents to sound more American. But why is a Filipino accent considered unprofessional or even bad? Or think about job applications. Why do employers in the Philippines demand excellent English communication skills, even for jobs that don't need it? In the Philippines, even roles like cashiers, security guards, and factory workers, employers prioritize English, and thus shutting out skilled Filipinos who struggle with formal English. We can't deny that this system favors those who grew up fluent, who are often from wealthier backgrounds, while sidelining many who are equally capable workers from rural and underserved communities. No matter where you go in the Philippines, those who struggle with English often have fewer career opportunities, leading to systemic disadvantages. And this issue is not just about language, it is about opportunity. Because sadly, in a democratic country like the Philippines, opportunity is not always distributed equally. So, are you telling us that we should abandon English and just focus on Tagalog or Filipino? No, that's not what I'm saying. The real issue is not English itself. Don't get me wrong, this is not about rejecting English at all. This is all about valuing all our languages equally, not just English and not just Tagalog. In fact, some of the world's strongest economies, like Switzerland, Singapore, and Canada, thrive by embracing linguistic diversity. Studies show that children learn better when they start with their mother tongue before transitioning to a second or even a third language. Indeed, bilingual education does not weaken English proficiency. It actually enhances literacy, comprehension, and more importantly, critical thinking. In fact, even here in California, we are required to learn a foreign language in high school and even in college, because the reality is, prioritizing English over comprehension does not create smarter students. It creates students who just memorize in one language but actually struggle to deeply understand the subject. And so multilingual education ensures knowledge comes first, not just language skills. Okay, this is off script, but what I find ironic and funny is that the president of the university who implemented this controversial English-only policy defended the policy by saying that we should follow the example of Singapore. Yet if you look at it, Singapore actually embraced linguistic diversity. Singapore actually has bilingual education policy. Singapore actually requires students to learn their mother tongues alongside English. So why are we forced to choose just one language when we can master many? I mean, Jose Rizal alone spoke about a dozen languages fluently. And if you think about it, why just choose to be just an airbender when you can master and bend all the elements like the Avatar? You know, for decades, policies have positioned English as the key to success, sidelining not only Filipino, but especially indigenous languages. So while the national language Filipino or Tagalog has received institutional support, native languages like Cebuano, Ilocano, Kapampangan, Hiligaynon, Maranao, Bahasa, and so many others have been marginalized in governance, education, and media. And even worse, at least 28 indigenous Philippine languages are now considered endangered, with sadly 11 languages on the brink of extinction, a direct result of the policies that treat linguistic diversity as a problem rather than a strength. We have to face reality that genuine empowerment means giving all of our languages the same respect, resources, and opportunities. Today, Filipinos rank among the top English speakers in the world, and we speak good English because historically, we had no choice. But now, we do have a choice, and we can choose to uplift and reclaim our languages. Because language is more than just communication. Language is deeply tied to our identity, our cultures, and our self-worth. Reclaiming our languages does not mean rejecting English. It means breaking free from this idea, from this belief that English alone should define success, that English alone should measure intelligence, progress, or even our worth as a human. strengthening policies that support multilingual education is key. Because again, studies confirm that students learn better when they start learning with their mother tongue. And we've actually seen this happen in the recent years. But without proper resources, training, and government support, these policies struggle to succeed. But it's not all bad news. In fact, here's the good news. Change is already happening. And at the grassroots, educators, historians, culture bearers, and advocates are racing to revive and preserve indigenous languages before they disappear, before we lose them forever. And you know, in the age of the internet, social media has actually become a powerful tool. Content creators, young and old, are using history, music, and storytelling to bring back pride to native languages, to encourage our younger generations to learn and love our mother tongues. Meanwhile, advocates across the country are also pushing for linguistic inclusivity in governance, legal proceedings, and public services. And if we look around, independent and mainstream media have actually been producing news and educational content in multiple languages, ensuring that more Filipinos have access to crucial information. And unknown to many in the Philippines, this is not just happening in the Philippines. I mean, here in California and in states like Hawaii, Washington, and New York, Filipino communities have been pushing for schools to teach not just Tagalog or Filipino, but other Philippine languages as well. Indeed, in Hawaii, Ilocano language programs have been established for decades, since the 70s, helping preserve the language and support one of the largest Ilocano-speaking communities outside the Philippines. Meanwhile, here in California, many public schools already offer Filipino as part of the curriculum, and thus making California, along with Hawaii, as one of the few places outside the Philippines where Philippine languages are formally recognized in the education system. And actually, when I was at UC Davis, I had the opportunity to teach one of the first college courses specifically dedicated to baybayin and kulitan outside the Philippines, introducing our indigenous scripts to younger Filipinos in the diaspora. And this is just one of the many ways Filipinos abroad, you know how despite being thousands of miles away from the motherland, we are still keeping our languages and cultures alive through education. And to be honest, these are all fun and exciting, but there's still so much more to do to make our languages more accessible, recognized, and truly appreciated. So what can we do? A lot actually. And we can start with supporting our local languages, speaking our mother tongues, supporting all these initiatives, and demanding better education policies. But more importantly, we must challenge this mindset that English alone, or even Filipino alone, should dominate at the expense of our many indigenous languages. Because if we truly want to educate, if we truly want to empower communities and break down barriers, then embracing our diverse cultures, embracing our diverse languages and people is not just an option. It is a necessity. Now, going back to that controversial English-only policy, they say that to be truly world-class, to be truly globally competitive, then we must prioritize and speak only English. But genuinely uplifting our people begins with understanding who we are and where we came from. And how can we understand our roots if we don't even care to understand our mother tongues? Because if we do not know our own histories, if we do not embrace our own roots, then we lose sight of who we are. Then we lose the ability and the power to create a brighter future. And as the saying goes, ang hindi marunong lumingon sa pinanggalingan ay hindi makakarating sa paroroonan. Or in Kapampangan, nung emeyag yung baligdan in kayakang milabas, emeyag yung dasan in kayakang bukas. And actually, one more quote. Ang hindi marunong magmahal sa sariling wika ay masahol pa sa hayop at malansang isda. Or in Kapampangan, masalingal-ngalyang palak, king lanam na ning mebilas ang asan, ing taong alang pakamal, king amano ng siswan. So if you're interested to learn more, for more discussions on our people's histories, cultures, and everything in between, make sure to check out my other videos on this channel. Maraming salamat po. Or in Kapampangan, dakal pong salamat kaya kongan and Ilocano agyang manaklaunay. See you next time on Tagalog Kita Kits and in Kapampangan, Mikitix, and in Binisaya, kita aita.